Welcome back to Information Systems and Cybersecurity 375. We're going to talk today about HTML structure elements. You may remember that last time we talked about HTML tags that allow you to do bolding and italicized text. We also talked about how to create links and embed images into a web page. Today we're going to go a step further. We had said before that the modern approach to web design is that we use HTML for the structure of a web page. If we want to do presentation type stuff, we do that with CSS, cascading style sheets. But we haven't yet talked about the structure elements, the tags that provide structure in HTML5. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. So to review, an HTML document always has a doc type tag at the top, and then it has an HTML tag that indicates the beginning of the document, and a /HTML tag at the bottom of the document that indicates that the document has ended. In between, we have two sections, a head section that identifies meta information related to the page, such as the title, and a body section that contains the content. So today we're going to talk about things we can put in that body section to add structure to the text or images that we want the user to see. So the two main tags that we're going to talk about today are the paragraph tag and also lists and tables. I guess that's three. So the three things we're going to talk about are the paragraph tag, lists, and tables. The paragraph tags are a paired tag. So there's a p tag, start tag, and a /p tag, the end tag. And everything between the p and /p is considered one paragraph. So if we have a long document, we can split it up into multiple paragraphs by taking each paragraph and putting a p in front and a /p at the end. Pages will naturally wrap in a web browser. One of the advantages of HTML is that no matter how big your screen is, the web browser will automatically wrap lines of text so that they fit on the screen. That makes things a little bit difficult for the web designer because the web designer doesn't know what kind of screen the user will be using. And so we can't manually put in line breaks that will look nice. However, sometimes it's nice to put in a line break. Maybe we want to put a blank line between two paragraphs. And so HTML does provide a BR tag. So here's an example of some code. It says this is a very short paragraph. It contains several small sentences. It's kind of a stupid example, which it is. And at the beginning, we have our p tag. At the end, we have our /p tag. And then notice I've left two blank lines. And then I have a second paragraph that starts with a p tag and a /p tag. What I want to point out here is that those blank lines won't show up in the web page. Those two blank lines I left between the paragraphs are not meaningful to the web browser. When the web browser sees them, it's just going to skip past them. It's the p and the /p tags that will tell it to start a new paragraph and wrap to the next line. If you want to get a blank line between two paragraphs, a good way to do that is to put two BR tags next to each other. The first BR tag will go to the next line, and then the second BR tag will skip one more line down. So here's what those examples would look like in the web browser. Notice that my first paragraph, because it's so short, it fits all in one line. If I were to make the window smaller, it would actually automatically wrap. So it would say this is a very short paragraph, it contains, and then maybe it would continue the rest of the sentence on the next line. The second paragraph had a break tag in it between the words a and line. And so the web browser renders that as this paragraph contains a, and then it breaks to the next line and says line break. No matter how big I make my screen, it will always wrap between the words a and line. Another important structure element is a heading. Headings are used to identify different sections of the document to the user. So we can have some text that identifies that particular part of the content. Headings are usually displayed in a larger font, and they're usually in bold. HTML actually provides 6 different levels of heading. The most important headings are the largest, and they are H1 headings. So if you use an H1 tag and a /H1 tag, you'll get a really large label that is in a bold font. The next most important heading is an H2 heading. H2 headings are slightly smaller than H1 headings, but still pretty large. H3 headings are a little bit smaller. H4 are a little bit smaller. And the least important headings are H6 headings, which are almost the same size as normal text and often aren't very dark. They don't even have to be bolded by the web browser, although they usually are. So here's another example. I have an H1 tag that says example paragraph and a /H1 tag ending the heading. So my heading will be example paragraph. Because it's an H1 tag, it'll be a very large and bold heading, which means that it's a very important heading. Beneath that, I have a paragraph. This is a very short paragraph. It contains several sentences. It's the paragraph from the previous example. Then beneath that, I have an H2 heading that says subsection. Because it's an H2 heading, it will be smaller than the H1 heading and not quite as bold, perhaps. And beneath that, I have another paragraph. One thing I want to point out is that because H1 headings are so big and important, they catch the eye, they're often used for page titles or for logos. So here's what that example would look like. At the top, we have the H1 heading that says example paragraph. Notice that it's big, it's dark, it's heavily bold. Beneath it, we have the paragraph. This is a short paragraph. Below that, we have our H2 heading. It's smaller than the H1 heading. It doesn't look quite as dark, but it's still a label for the second paragraph, which says this is another sample paragraph. Again, if I were to resize this window, the text would actually wrap to the next line. So right now, the window is just the right size to hold one line of text. Another structural element that separates content from other parts of the content is a horizontal rule. A horizontal rule is geek speak for a line. So if you want to draw just a normal black line across the page, you can use the HR tag, the horizontal rule tag. So here's an example of doing that. Here I have a paragraph that says you can separate sections with a horizontal rule using the, and notice the use of HTML entities. The ampersand LT semicolon is how I can get a less than symbol in my page. If I put an actual less than here, it would think I was starting a new tag, an HR tag, and it would embed a line. But I don't want the line yet. I want a less than, then the letters HR, and then a greater than. So I use the ampersand LT semicolon to get a less than. I use the ampersand GT semicolon to get a greater than. Then I have the word tag, a period, and I close my paragraph with a /p tag. Notice that in the middle of the document, I have an HR tag. That's where the line will show up. And then I have another paragraph that says like this. So when I render that, I get this. It says you can separate sections with a horizontal rule using the HR tag. And notice that right beneath it, there's this little faint line that separates the two sections. That's my horizontal rule. And below that, I have like this. So there's different kinds of content that you might want to represent. Paragraphs are great for unstructured content. If I just have text that I want to present to the user, maybe a story that I want to tell, or some kind of news article, or an essay, or if I'm describing a club or something, I might have some structure to it because I might have headings and break it up into different sections, but typically it's not very structured. I can also have content that's very highly structured, and one structure I can have is a list. So I can have a list of items. Maybe it's a to-do list. Maybe it's a list of people in my club, the cybersecurity club. Maybe it's just a list of important dates. I could also have data that's organized into a table. It's in row and column form. Or I could have forms that I want to fill out and submit information to the server using. We're not going to talk about forms today. We're going to talk about that later when we talk about server-side processing and what to do with the form. But today we're going to talk about lists and tables. There are actually three kinds of lists in HTML. There's an ordered list, or what's displayed as a numbered list. There's an unordered or bulleted list. And finally, there's a list called a dictionary list that's used to match definitions to terms. So an unordered list might look like this. Notice we use the UL tag for unordered list, and we mark the end of the list with a /UL tag at the bottom. Each item in the list is identified with an LI tag. LI stands for list item. So LI and /LI identify one element of the list. So here I have item 1, item 2, item 3, and each of them is in an LI and a /LI tag. Unordered lists typically are displayed using bullet points. You can actually embed a list inside a list. So inside one of those list items, for example, I could put another UL tag and a /UL tag and have several LIs inside to make a nested list. Typically, if you do that, the web browser will use one kind of bullet for the outer list, and the nested list will use a different style of bulleting. So for example, you might have a circle for your bullets for the outer list, and the inner list might use squares or diamonds, or an open circle instead of a closed circle, or different colors. And you can often modify that style using the style sheets. So ordered lists are similar, but instead of UL for unordered list, we use OL for ordered list. Ordered lists are numbered. So instead of having bullet points, it'll say 1, item 1, 2, item 2, 3, item 2. And just like the unordered list, we can have sublists that nest inside this list. And instead of using numbers, they'll often be identified with letters. You're probably familiar with this syntax because you may have done it in English class for making an outline of a document, or maybe you've seen something like it in Microsoft Word. If you tab over and start a new list, it'll use letters instead of numbers, and then Roman numerals, and then it goes back to lowercase letters or something along those lines. So here's what this would look like in the web browser. Notice that at the top I have my unordered list, item 1, item 2, item 3 with just bullet points. And then below that I have an ordered list with numbers, 1, 2, 3. Dictionary lists are significantly different. Dictionary lists are kind of this odd thing. And the idea is that we're taking two different pieces of information and we're showing a relationship between them. So perhaps I have a list of students that come to Cybersecurity Club, and I want to keep track of how many meetings they've attended. I could show that relationship with a dictionary list. Or maybe I have players in a game and I want to keep track of their scores. Or I have a list of employees and their spouses. So a dictionary list is really good at illustrating relationships between two data sets. So a dictionary list starts with a DL tag and ends with a /DL tag. And then each item in the list actually has two parts. We don't use an LI tag with a dictionary list. Instead, we have a DT tag and a DD tag. The DT tag defines the dictionary term. The DD tag identifies the dictionary definition. So we have a term and a definition that goes with it. So in this case, I have DT term 1 /DT, and then DD definition 1 /DD. That maps term 1 to definition 1. And so they'll be displayed in a way that illustrates this relationship between term 1 and definition 1. Similarly, I have code that illustrates the relationship between term 2 and definition 2. So for example, I could create a dictionary list and a term, George. George is now the key in my key value relationship. George is the term, and I'm going to match him with a definition. So then in the DD tags, I have the number 23. That's George's age, for instance. So I'm mapping George to the age 23. I could also say, okay, Sharon is 30. Chris is 16. The names are going to be my dictionary terms, my DT tags, and the ages will be my definitions, my DD tags. I could put absolutely any kind of information in as my DT tag. I could put absolutely any kind of information as my DD tag. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that I'm illustrating the relationship between things in one set with things in the other. So one set of things will go in between DT tags. The other will go in DD tags. So that would look like this. Notice that the DT, the terms show up on one line, and the definitions actually show up on another, and they're indented. So this illustrates the relationship between these things. So this tells me George is 23, Sharon is 30, and Chris is 16. Another form of structured data is a table. Tabular data might represent something like a schedule, or perhaps some kind of data that's been collected in a spreadsheet, so sensor data. I'm actually working on a project right now where we're collecting environmental sensor data from several different sites. And so we might have a table that shows sensor readings for different kinds of sensors, the temperature, the humidity, solar radiation. And then we might, on the rows, list the different sites that we're collecting data from. So this is a great use of tables, and HTML provides a table tag that will allow us to represent tabular data. However, historically, tables were also used for something else. Before cascading style sheets became available, there was no easy way to position the elements of a web page and lay them out the way that you wanted them to appear on the page. And so a lot of web designers, and I was one of them, I admit, back in the 90s before cascading style sheets became popular, we would use tables to position elements on the page. Because a table gives you rows and it gives you columns, and so you can put things where you want them by positioning them in the table. This is a terrible, terrible idea. This leads to really messy code. It becomes very difficult to move things on the page without completely messing up the table. you wind up with elements that have to span multiple columns and span multiple rows. And if you move one, you have to adjust the entire table, and you probably break something. So this is a maintenance nightmare. You shouldn't use HTML tables for layout. Only use HTML tables for tabular data. If something naturally fits into a table, if you would want to represent it with a spreadsheet, use an HTML table tag. If you want to put it in a particular place on the page, instead use cascading style sheets. That's what they're designed for. So here's an example of how we can use the table tag to represent tabular data. This is the same data we looked at with the dictionary list a minute ago. So again, we start with a table tag and we end with a slash table tag. Notice that we then have 4 lines that each represent one row of the table. In HTML, tables are always laid out one row at a time. We always do them in row order. We don't lay out tables from left to right using the columns. We start at the top of the table and we put one row at a time into the HTML document. We identify the beginning of a row with a tr tag and the end of a row with a slash tr tag. Within each row, there are 2 different tags that we use. The th tag stands for table header, and it represents a label that identifies the contents of a column or part of a column. So for example, in the first row, we have a th tag for the name, followed by a th tag for the age. And that tells the web browser that the first column is the name and the second column is the age. On the second row, we have a td tag. td stands for table data. Data cells begin with a td tag and end with a slash td tag. So the first table data cell in the second row has the word George in it. George is going to be the content of that first cell of the table. In the next cell, we have the age 23. So George, 23 are data cells, and we delimit them with a td and a slash td tag. So that table would look like this. So notice a couple things about this. First of all, the table headers are in bold, and they're at the top of the table. You actually can't tell it, but they're also centered. The data cells are not bolded, and they're actually left aligned. So here we have George is 23. The next row, Sharon is 30. And we have 2 columns in the last row. Chris is 16. A couple points about this. I think I already said th is used for headers, td for data cells. You can actually have multiple rows that contain headers. You might have one table that contains 2 sections. So you might have like 2014 data in the top and 2013 data in the bottom, and the column labels might be slightly different. So you might have 2 sets of headers, one for the 2014 data and one for the 2013 data. By default, table headers are bolded and they are centered, and the table data cells are left aligned. In addition to the td, th, and table and tr tags, there are some attributes that you can use to tell the web browser how to display a table. One of those is the call span attribute. If you put the call span attribute in a td or th tag, you can create a data cell that spans more than one column. So for example, if I have a label, maybe it's the title of the table, I can tell it to span all of the columns, and then I just put that one data cell at the top in the top row, and it won't put lines in between the cells. And actually, we could use CSS to center it, so it would look really nice. Similarly, there's a row span attribute. Again, this is for td and th tags. And the row span attribute will indicate that an element spans multiple rows. This one's a little bit tricky to use, because in the next row, you have to remember that you have this element that spans 2 rows, and you have to remember to skip it. If you don't, you'll have the wrong number of data cells, and your table will get off by 1 column. There's also a headers attribute. We can identify each header cell with an ID tag. And then for each table data cell, we can use the headers attribute to tell the web browser that there's a connection between this data cell and that header. This actually doesn't do anything to the layout or the look of the page, but it's useful to people using screen readers, usually the visually handicapped, because then the screen reader can more easily line up the information, and it allows them to navigate by saying, okay, we have this age column, give me all the ages, something along those lines. The table tag itself also has some attributes that are useful. One is a border attribute. This specifies the width of the border around the table. By default, tables have no visible border, but you can set a border to be 1 or 2 pixels wide, and then you'll get this nice line around the table showing the edge of the table. It's actually better not to use the border tag, the border attribute, but instead use CSS to style the table. We haven't learned how to do that yet, so for now we're going to use the border attribute. Another attribute is the sortable attribute. If you mark a table as sortable, the web browser, if it supports this feature, will allow the user to click on a table header and sort the rows of the table by the data in that column. So here's an example table that uses some of those features. Notice I have my table tag, and inside I have a border attribute, and I set the border equal to 1 pixel. So when I display the table, there'll be a border of 1 pixel all the way around the table. And also in between all the cells, there'll be a 1 pixel border. I then have a table row that contains a table header tag. Notice that the first th and /th don't have anything between them. That's a way to skip the first column so that my Monday label will show up in the second column. Then I have a table header tag with an ID attribute and the label Monday. A /th tag to show that the second column, is done. And then I create the third column by creating a header for Tuesday. I create a header for Wednesday, for Thursday, and for Friday in a similar manner. And then I use the /tr tag to indicate that the first row is done. In the second row, I have a table data cell in which I've put 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock a.m. That's followed by an empty table data cell, so it will skip the second column. And in the third column, I have a TD tag that is linked to the Tuesday header that contains CMSE 160. That's one of the programming courses I teach. That's followed by an empty table data cell, and then followed by another CMSE 160 that's linked to the Thursday header. At the end of that row, again, I have a /tr tag. Notice in the third row, I have one table data cell with a label 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock a.m., and it's followed by only one more table data cell, and this one uses the call span attribute to span all 5 columns from Monday to Friday. Notice that in the headers attribute, I can use a semicolon separated list of IDs to associate that data cell with all 5 of the labels for the days of the week. And that data is just the words study session. So every day of the week, we're going to have a study session. That study session cell will span all 5 columns, and it's linked to each day of the week label. Finally, I have a fourth row that has Math 164 in the second column and in the fourth column and the sixth column. So this is what this looks like. Notice that my table headers start with a blank cell and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The data that's related to them is displayed below. I want to point out that the study session data cell spans 5 columns. It spans from Monday to Friday, and there are no lines in between the different days of the week for that row. So we've talked about different ways to display structured content within the web page, but HTML also provides tags for identifying different parts of the web page. In other words, for telling the web browser what the overall structure of the page itself is. One of those tags is a main tag. The main tag identifies the main content of a page. A modern web page often has lots of content that is not related to the main content. For example, I might have advertisements on the side. I might have a logo at the top. I probably have some kind of navigation bar with some links. All of these things are important, but they're not part of the main content of the page. So HTML5 added a new tag, the main tag, that identifies the main content of the page. HTML5 also added a nav tag that allows me to identify the navigation bars on my page. I might actually have multiple navigation bars, one at the top of the page for navigating the website, and possibly some others within the page for navigating different parts of the website, maybe for browsing within the content of the page, scrolling up and down, that kind of thing. The main content of my page is often divided up into separate parts that are independent, and we can use the article tag to label those. For example, if my web page is some kind of blog, I probably have several different posts on each page. Each post is an independent article. Independent in this context means that if I took it and put it on its own web page, it would still be valuable and of use. these different independent sections often have identifying information, like a title or an author's name. HTML5 provides a header tag that allows me to specify that I'm providing that kind of information. Usually the header tag is placed immediately above the section of content that it identifies. Usually you put H2, H3, other kinds of headings tags inside a header tag. I want to point out that a header tag is not the same as the head tag. That little ER on the end makes a huge difference. The head tag, you'll remember, is used for things like the title of the page in the window or in the tab. It's also used for setting settings about the page, like the character set, and linking it to style sheets. So the head information contains metadata about the web page. The header tag provides title and author. It provides information that the user sees about a particular section of the page. The header tag is also different from headings tags like H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Those display a label. The header tag actually doesn't display anything. It just groups some things together to make the web browser more aware of how the page is structured. HTML5 also added a footer tag. Like the header tag, this provides information about a piece of the web page, but this information is usually displayed below the content. So for example, a copyright notice might be there, or maybe some content information for the webmaster or the author of a blog post. In addition, there's an aside tag that's used for creating sidebars. A sidebar contains information that's not part of the main content of the page, but is related to it. So a sidebar usually is not positioned inside the page. It's often up to the side. That's why it's called the sidebar. Advertisements can go in sidebars. Sometimes the navigation bar will be in a sidebar. Or sometimes there's useful quotes or other information that's related that go in the sidebar. So here's an example of a page that uses some of these structure elements. Notice I've got my doc type tag in the usual boilerplate code we've been using all along. And then within the body, I have a header section containing the H3 heading, My Fabulous Blog. And that header is associated with a navigation bar. So here's this nav section, the nav tag and /nav tag, that contain a nav bar, a list of links. And in order to list those links, I'm using an unordered list. So there's a UL tag and a /UL tag identifying the start and end of that list of links. Within the UL tags, there's a list of 3 LI elements, each of which contains a link, an anchor, an A tag, to a different page of my site: home, about, and contact me. Oh, let me go back. Notice that I put some dots in here. Those wouldn't actually appear in the document. That's just my way of indicating to you that there's actually more content in this page, and I'm going to show you that content now. So where those dots were, I might add content like this. A main tag identifies the main content of my page. By the way, this role attribute is a new feature of HTML5 that's useful for accessibility reasons. It identifies the particular purpose of this section of the page, and so role equals main is what's called a way aria tag, a way aria attribute that helps screen readers, again, understand the page better. At the top of the main content, I have an H3 tag that says recent posts. And then I have a series of articles, and each article has a header above it that has its title and author name. So the first article has the title Favorite Stories, and it's by Dr. Marmerstein. And the article is just one paragraph that says, my favorite story is the Iliad, which is true. This is the story of the wrath of Achilles. And then it says, it puts me right to sleep. The next article has a header with a title and an author name. The title is Boring Class, and the author is Stu Dent. And again, it's just a simple paragraph. In a real web page, these would probably be much longer. There might be multiple paragraphs within each article. But in order to make it fit on the slide, I've got some really short paragraphs here. Outside of my main section, I might have a footer with a copyright notice. And I might have an aside, a sidebar, with a quote of the day. So I picked this quote. This is one of my favorite computer scientists, Edsger Dijkstra. Edsger may have said this quote. It's actually unclear whether this came from him or not. But the quote is that computer science is no more about computers than astronomy is about telescopes. So if I were to actually render this in the page, it doesn't look very interesting because we're not using CSS yet. But you can see that all of the H3 tags are here, all of the links are here, my paragraphs are here. In fact, it really is kind of boring because the header tag, the main tag, the aside tag, the footer tag, all those extra tags I added didn't do anything to the look of the page. So what's the point of having them? Well, they didn't do anything to the look of the page yet because we haven't applied cascading style sheets. When we learn about CSS next week, you'll be able to do a lot more with these tags. And so I wanted to show you what that would look like. Here's an example of what you might do with these. Notice that my nav bar is now centered at the top of the page. It says home about contact me. I have a sidebar now with my quote of the day that has a different background color. I've put a border around each article so you can see each post in its own little box. This looks a lot nicer, and it's much easier to do if we use the article tags and the main tag and the nav tag and the aside tag than if we just use a div and span, which are what we used to use before HTML5. So here's what I want you to take away from today's lecture. First of all, the main structural elements in HTML are the paragraph tag and the headings tags, H1 through H6. Turns out HTML5 actually added more headings tags. They're not H7 through H100 or something like that. There's a new way to do it that gives you additional levels of heading. That's a little bit beyond what I want to talk about in this course. HTML actually provides three kinds of lists: unordered lists, numbered lists, and dictionary lists. It also provides tables. Tables consist of rows, headers, and data cells. They should be used to display tabular content not used for layout or formatting. We use CSS for that. Separation of content from presentation, a really key principle. And finally, HTML5 provides additional structure elements that identify the different parts of the page and what they contain. Thank you for listening. Looking forward to talking with you again next week.